Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session, Principlism as a Guiding Framework for Responsible AI Adoption in Higher Education. I'm Dr. Ron Johnson, co-editor of the International Journal of Open Educational Resources, and will be the chair of this session. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to please mute your microphones to avoid any background noise. If you have questions for the presenter, please type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will address these during the session. It is now my honor to introduce our presenter, Mr. Pritin Shah.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. My name is Priyan, and today I'm presenting some early ideas that I'm working on how we might think about AI ethics in terms of the policies we make at our educational institutions. Before I get started, a little bit about me. I have a background in philosophy and policy, and so I'd like to think about how the technology developments that we're seeing, what are the philosophical questions that they raise for how we think about education, the purpose of education, ethics around them, and then how do we make policies to kind of adapt to those new questions and answers that we're going to get as we ask these larger questions. The recent author of the book, AI and the Future of Education, Teaching in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, that's published last fall by Wiley. And I currently work on providing professional development, creating online tools, and doing some more thought leadership and asking some of these questions on AI and education. So today I'm going to draw on the work of Professor Mira Levinson. So she's a political philosopher who works at the Harvard Education School, and she draws on political philosophy to ask larger questions of educational ethics. And so she's trying to establish a field of educational ethics. And today we'll draw on some of her ideas to kind of see what that might look like if we were to use AI in education as a starting point to have some of these conversations at our educational institutions. So we'll start with what does AI in higher education look like? What is the landscape that we need to think about and be on the same page about in order to make sense of some of the later arguments that I make? Then I'll introduce Principlism, which is a bioethical framework for making ethical decisions in medicine. I'll talk about what the principles are that they've argued for and how those might apply to the world of education. And then I'll go through some case studies that will allow us to kind of do these things, practice these skills live during today's session. And we can use the chat or you can raise your hand and we can kind of interact with each other a little bit and think through together how we might apply the idea of a framework for ethical decision-making, borrowing from bioethics to the world of AI and education. Okay, so let's start with setting the stage a little bit. There's growing adoption of AI. We're starting to see most teaching and learning platforms have found some way to talk about AI and integrate it. Everything from making lesson plans and building curricula to finding ways to use it for assessment and grading. And most ed tech tools will, if not already will have some sort of AI integration by the end of this calendar year, it seems. And so there's clearly growing presence of it throughout the education space. There's also a rapid pace of innovation. So, the kinds of challenges that we saw 2 years ago are no longer the same challenges that we're facing even this fall. And that's going to continue to develop. And so as the technology gets stronger, as it continues to develop in new ways, brings new ethical challenges, we will have to keep staying current, both on what how we integrate it within education, but also what our ethical stances are on the various ways of using the technology or not using it. And we have institutional motivations for pursuing, thinking about this in a systematic way. And so if we embrace AI, there are ways that it might improve efficiency in our school systems. There are ways that we can use it to enhance student experience. And also, we want to make sure that our students are prepared for the digital age. And so there are reasons why we will want to make sure that we're staying current with these new developments. So we'll start with the benefits, and these are, the benefits and the risks are probably talked about a lot, but just to, again, to make sure we're all using the same language. Some of the potential benefits that folks are touting include personalized learning experiences, and so we might have adaptive content delivery. We might be able to create exactly, what assessments, materials that target a student's individual needs, individual interests, all of those kinds of things. there's increased administrative efficiency. And so folks have been talking about how they can use it to do reports and write emails and write grant proposals, which I think all of us would be very thankful for. But it automates some of our routine tasks that also can be offloaded to AI. There's the potential for it to improve accessibility and inclusivity. There's lots of assistive technologies that are coming out that quickly adapt online technology to become more accessible. So make it screen reader compatible, provide alt text to images, all sorts of things we're starting to see. And, it's all this technology is obviously still in its infancy. Language translations on the fly, all of those kinds of things will improve accessibility and inclusivity. And then there might be room for us to even think about how the AI might work in research and innovation. And so there's tools that are being made right now to kind of speed up literature reviews. There's tools that are being made to enhance data analysis, and that will continue to grow. One interesting use case I've seen recently is non-first language scholars whose English is not their first language have been able to use some AI tools to kind of get their scholarship to a written level that's acceptable by some of the international journals. And so, we'll continue to see some more research-specific innovations, but these are maybe some of the things that we could talk about in terms of benefits. And this is not an exhaustive list. And far more interesting to me, and I think the kinds of things that I hope we can spend some time talking about, because I think everybody's talking a lot about the benefits, are the ethical challenges and risks that I think AI will also bring and is bringing for us. And so a concern that we all have been thinking about and talking about for any digital technology are privacy concerns. These tools function very well when they have more data on you. And so we will have to think about, what risk does that create for our own privacy and our students' privacy? There's documented algorithmic bias in all of these tools. And we can talk about some of those examples if anybody wants. But there's all instances of all sorts of implicit biases in the algorithms and sometimes explicit bias as well. There's lack of transparency from the actual AI companies. And so whether it be OpenAI, who you would think would be a little bit more open about their data sets and how they're building their algorithms, or even quote unquote open source models, there is very little information that we actually have about how they're working, what the data is that's going into them, and exactly what's happening behind the scenes. Accountability is far too low for AI technology across at least the United States. We're starting to see some policy in the EU in particular that's a little bit more, holds companies to be more accountable. But in the US, we're starting to see that it's not really happening. I have very little faith that we're going to see a lot of top-down accountability from the federal government. We have not yet caught up on social media, so I'm skeptical that we'll somehow manage to catch up on AI at a rigorous level. And so a lot of the accountability is being offloaded to individual consumers. What tools are we using? What tools are we bringing into our schools? And then they're asking the industry to self-regulate, which I will spare more commentary on because I think most educators will share my concern for what self-accountability might mean for a tech company. There's also risks to what this might do for students' critical thinking. And so all other forms of technology that have increased in the past, and so whether it be your calculator or your GPS, has the diminishment in our students' ability to do things. And so mathematical reasoning skills are lower than they were before the advent of calculators, and spatial reasoning skills are much lower than they were before the advent of GPS. And so if the equivalent for AI large language models in particular is critical thinking, then we have concerns for what this means for our innate abilities to think and reason and speak to one another and communicate. There's lots of risks and challenges when it comes to the digital divide. And so broadband access across the country is still not equal. Device access across the country is still not equal. And tech literacy across the country is still not equal. And that's true even within educational institutions, let alone, nationally. And so all of these, as the technology continues to grow, we start to see that there's price barriers to some of the technology, and the technology requires certain devices to work well. And some people can afford algorithms on their personal computers that protect their privacy, and others cannot. We're going to continue to see that the digital divide is an important factor in how we think about educational equity across the country. There will be job displacement. There has already been some job displacement that's being documented, but definitely as the algorithms continue to get stronger, the technology continues to get stronger, and more industries adapt and use them, we will start seeing that some jobs that were available for our students will no longer be available, and that will have massive economic impacts as well as individual impacts on our students. And then we also want to think about what the ethical use and misuse of the technology is. And this has been predominantly a huge focus of how we've approached the conversation in the beginning. And so I think a lot of folks initially started thinking about AI from the angle of, are our students misusing it? Are they using it to plagiarize? Are they cheating on their assignments? But as the technology continues to get stronger, we'll want to figure out what is ethical use and what is considered misuse. And so these are all some, large ethical challenges and risks that we'll have to think about. But these are daunting. None of these are individually, each of these could probably take up, hours and hours of our time, and we could talk about them together and how we might approach them. And we don't have the resources, especially as technology grows constantly, as institutions to kind of come up with a single policy that will live through all of the changes and kind of solve all of these biases, solve all of these risks rather. And so what might we do? And this is where I draw on the work of Professor Levinson, who tries to use the closest thing to educational ethics that exists currently, which is bioethics. And so they faced a similar issue where there were lots of immediate questions that institutions that were directly at the front lines, hospitals, had to make in terms of providing care to their constituents, their patients. And so they worked to establish this field in the 1970s to come up with this, how might these institutions make ethical decisions when the technology is dramatically changing rapidly. These decisions are different from institution to institution. These aren't as simple as ethical questions of is murder good or bad? They're questions of allocation. They're questions of institutional priorities. And so a scholar sitting in a particular room is not going to tell you, this type of AI technology is bad for everybody. These are more nuanced conversations that will have to happen at the institutional level, the same way that, an institution might decide how they're going to prioritize, where they invest in which positions they hire first, depending on their patient population's individual needs, rather than a professor sitting somewhere saying everybody needs to hire more cardiologists across the country because that's the ethical thing to do. There's no such way to think about it. And we might see similar patterns with questions in educational ethics. And so these issues are complex. All of these challenges are interconnected. We'll see that some of these things, and we'll talk about some examples of these. There are competing interests between some of these, especially the benefits and the risks, but even amongst benefits and amongst the risks. There's coming up with a singular policy, like I said, is not going to be feasible because the change is so rapid. And there are lots of different stakeholders. So, maybe even when you think about it within the bioethical world, you do still, a world of bioethics, you still have, singular patient populations that you're thinking about. Whereas it's not very clear there's not a single population we need to think about when we think about education. And so we want to think about what's good for our students. We want to think about what's good for our faculty. Administrators have a say in this and have a stake in this. Parents do. And society as at large. And so the idea of figuring out what is the right ethical thing is substantially complicated by how many different people's lives are at stake in some fashion or another. And so we want to make sure that everybody is empowered to make these decisions themselves. And so rather than coming up with this, the answer to all these questions, and I sit here and I tell you, okay, this is what I think is the ethical way to deal with XYZ, I'm hoping that we can establish some shared language so that we can have conversations at our institutions about what we think the ethical thing is for us to do within our individual contexts. Okay. Before I move on to the principlism, I talk a little fast sometimes, and this is a lot of content. And so I want to make sure that if anybody has a question or needs me to pause and repeat anything, you can either raise your hand or drop something in the chat. But I want to give everybody a chance to check in before I keep going. Okay, I can post maybe 15, 20 more seconds, and then I'll keep going. But please just drop in the chat if at any point you need me to slow down or revisit a point. I'm covering the entirety of establishing a framework of ethics for education is hard in 45 minutes, and I'm trying to do justice to it. But perfect, awesome. I got at least one good to go, so I'll keep at it for now. But please feel free to drop any comments in the chat if need be. So there's various theories within bioethics. There's not just one framework that they use. There's one that in particular that I have been using for having some of these conversations with educators, and I draw on the idea. The framework is called Principlism. And the Principlism is supposed to bridge the gap between theory and practice and provide some theoretical basis for us to make real practical decisions on a quick basis. It's very flexible, it's adaptable, it doesn't require any sort of principles on it doesn't require establishing anything about AI in education or what we want or the goods we want or what we want for our students. None of that is required for us to adapt this framework for us to have these conversations. And as you'll notice when I go through these principles, it parallels very well what kinds of things we care about as educators in a way that's very similar to what medical professionals care about. And so those 4 core principles that bioethicists use are respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And I'll explain all of those shortly. And these really do help us provide a framework to ask questions of ourselves and our institutions and say, how do we assess these things? What might we think about from this angle or this angle? Have you considered this from this angle or this angle? And that's what the hope is today, is that this spurs some conversations. It provides you the vocabulary to challenge, your colleagues, your students, and even these AI companies as to what is right for our students and for our educational systems. So let's go through the principles now. Like I said, it's based on these 4 fundamental principles. It's a framework that was developed by 2 bioethicists. And the whole idea is to provide a way for us to balance and apply these principles in context. And that's why at the end of this, we'll go through some case studies, because the point isn't to come up with some 4 concepts and sit with them and say, okay, this is the end all be all of thinking about this from the ethical perspective. It really is to figure out how are we going to practically apply this on a regular, real basis when we're faced with decisions, tomorrow. There's out of the 4 principles, there's no principle that by default takes precedence. And so as we go through them, each of them might conflict at times, and that will provide great points for conversation, but also make this a little bit more complex. But there's no ordering between the principles. And this is what allows it to be very simple at the basic level, very simple for us to grasp in a 45-minute session, but also take away and really start asking questions of ourselves after the session. And so that's really why I find this a really good starting place for folks who want to think about ethics in a more, a systematic way. There's some limitations, though, and one that I've been asked repeatedly, which is that there are no answers. There is no definitive answer to any of the questions we'll raise today. It's not going to, it's not a mathematical theory that will give you the exact same answer if somebody else tries it out. You all will come up with different interpretations of the exact same principles and how they apply to the exact same ethical questions. And I think that's what makes ethics and philosophy interesting. But I realize that is distressing to some who are hoping that we can come up with some universal set of norms for this. And I hope for a more bottom-up approach of, can we all have these conversations, start to come up with some sort of consensus amongst at least our institutions about what our norms ought to be, rather than top-down come up with some norms that apply to everybody. And it will require lots of nuanced decisions. And so this is where having some sort of shared vocabulary is really helpful. So a quick overview of the 4 principles. Some of them are self-explanatory, but respect for autonomy means that you recognize individuals' right to self-determination. It includes things like informed consent and making sure that the actual stakeholders are making the decisions. And you'll see examples in a second. Beneficence is making sure they're promoting the well-being and providing benefit by any of the actions we take, that we're taking active steps to help others. Non-maleficence is the do no harm principle in medicine, and so it's making sure that anything we do avoids harm towards our stakeholders and constituents. And then justice is making sure that there's a fair distribution of both the benefits and the risks, and that everybody has equal treatment and access to that treatment. And as you can, some of you are probably having some light bulb moments about why this provides a really great framework for thinking about the exact kinds of things that we want to think about as educators, and that overlap so well with how medical professionals think about it. So when we think about these things in terms of AI and education, there's some really easy parallels to draw to kind of help start to make that connection. So for respect for autonomy, we might think about whether or not students have agency in terms of determining when AI is and isn't used in their learning process. Are they providing informed consent for what kind of data we're collecting about them and how we're using it? Beneficence, when we want to think about, are we doing something that's actually benefiting the students, or are we only embracing AI for the sake of embracing AI because it's the fad or it's cool to do? Are we supporting students in a robust way, in a holistic way? Are we supporting their well-being and growth and not just hyper-fixating on academic achievement? Non-maleficence, are we making sure that we're not harming our students by introducing these technologies, and are we mitigating those harms when we know they're going to happen? Or how are we preventing the bias and discrimination that is documented in AI algorithms and the harm it might do to our students? How are we being proactive in safeguarding student data and privacy so that it's not used for misinformation campaigns or to manipulate our students? And then justice, how do we ensure that there's equitable access to AI resources? And then how do we make sure that AI-assisted assessments and other technologies that will adapt to our students' learning, will be part of our students' learning, treat all of our students fairly? So let's go through, we're going to go through principle by principle, and I'll start with respect for autonomy. So there's a couple of nuance, and the slides will be shared. And so again, in the interest of time, I might not hyperfixate on any one of these and try to get you some real examples sooner, but I do want to go through, these are more complex. The textbook itself that established this framework is about a 500-page textbook. And I'm trying to distill it down into a 45-minute presentation and relate it to education as quickly as I can. But there's some real good nuanced heuristics that we might use from the way that they think about it in terms of bioethics that are really useful for us. And I'm kind of trying to pull those out for us in education. And so we talked about recognizing individual self-determination. We talked about respecting personal choices and decisions. But informed consent is a large part of this in medicine. And we ought to think that that ought to be an important thing for educators as well. So we want to make sure that our students know what exactly they're risking when they're using an AI system, whether it be voluntarily on their own or mandated by our educational institutions. And that they understand what the actual risks and consequences are, and not just, oh, this is, what's the benefit that you might get from this. That they have the right to refuse or withdraw, that they have the right to try it out and decide that this is not the right thing for them, that they prefer human interaction, that they prefer a non-AI technology. They ought to have that right once they've opted into even using AI. There should be autonomy in the decision making. And so, this is very similar to how we make most educational decisions, but we want to make sure that there's not, controlling influences, there's not grade biases based on how they're approaching this, and that the students are, when they're making these decisions, making them in terms of what they feel is best for them after being fully informed about all of the risks and knowing what alternatives exist to the technology as well. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit, is that, AI might not be the end all be all for everything we want for our students. And even if it is a solution, we might still want to offer our students alternative solutions that get us to the same goal, because that provides them that autonomy in making that decision for themselves. And we want to respect their privacy and confidentiality. And so we want to make sure that they have the tools that we are using do that for them. And so if the students are worried about how their personal political viewpoints might be misused by an AI company, we want to make sure those are not the companies that we're working with or encouraging our students to work with, so that those kinds of things are respected for our students. So in the educational context, the way we might apply this is that we want to think about the students that are learning at the forefront of it, right? So making sure the students are empowered to figure out which tools they want to use. Students are there's informed participation. Students are choosing whether or not they engage with AI learning tools. Students have control over their data. And so maybe there's ways for them to use the data, use these tools and not give up all of their data and only provide exactly the data they want to provide in order to get the exact benefits that they want to get. And this mirrors privacy regulations that are coming out in the EU. We don't have as robust set of regulations in the US, but opting into only providing the data that you want to provide in order to get only the benefit that you get is a concept in tech privacy that isn't completely random and isn't completely impossible to implement, because it is implemented by major tech companies in Europe. And we want to make sure that the actual design of these algorithms is ethical, that they're not trying to manipulate our students when they're using them, that there's not subtle advertising happening, that companies aren't paying AI providers to prioritize their resources, prioritize certain language or viewpoints as the model is developed. And we can talk about the realisticness of that concern if folks want, but these are real things that we ought to worry about, especially as we see the kinds of contracts that major AI companies are signing. And so when OpenAI signs contracts with certain journalists and certain institutions and prioritizes that kind of information in its training, that does something for how we then process their output. And that is something we want to think about. So some of the challenges include we want to be careful about the echo chambers that these algorithms will create. So we've already seen the danger that the echo chambers from social media. Those echo chambers are going to be much worse when the actual written content is also tailored to an individual's particular perspective, political viewpoint, wants. And we want to make sure that that prevents an over-reliance. We want to prevent an over-reliance on AI-generated insights. And so we still want to make sure that our students are not blindly following whatever the AI tools are telling them, and that they're still building that, the critical thinking skills, the digital literacy skills to really dissect what is being said, and kind of seek further, viewpoints, seek further resources to back that up. We want to make sure that all of our privacy concerns are addressed. And so whether this be something as simple as making sure privacy agreements are in line with what kinds of goals that we have as an institution, to limiting what kinds of information we send, to also helping our students make the right decisions about what information they themselves are sharing with AI algorithms. Again, very similar to how we've had conversations about social media and our students. We also want to make sure that there is robust AI literacy before they have to make any of these decisions. And so on day one of this school year, if students are being asked to opt into or out of AI use, they might still not have the full understanding of what the risks are, what the benefits are, and what exactly they're giving up by opting into using AI or not. And so we want to make sure we spend some time helping them build the knowledge about what exactly these things look like as well. And one of the things we'll start to see, and this is where the tensions come up, is that we might start to see some benefits in terms of personalization. We might say, okay, that's a autonomy-based good. That's a benefit that our students have because they get to make more decisions about what's interesting to them, what's better for them. But we might realize that that's actually at odds with what the student themselves wants to do, versus what the system is telling them is good for them. And so these are the kinds of tensions that we want to start thinking about. When a system says, okay, no, you should pursue, do these kinds of math problems right now, or do these problem sets. But the student says, no, but I think that I need help on this particular thing, even if the system is telling me this. What autonomy are we giving them to make that decision? Are we saying, no, like the system only allows you to go through what the system is telling you to do? Or are we going to say, no, you can opt out of the system's recommendations, and still pursue what you think you need? And that's how you start to see the challenges of like autonomy, as they might pop up as the technology becomes more prevalent. So yeah, I feel like I've talked about the strategy, so I'm going to move on to the principles just so that we can kind of keep it moving on and make sure I cover all of them. The second one is beneficence. And so this is one that's probably more intuitive to all of us. We want to make sure that we're promoting good and well-being for our students. And so it's not just about avoiding harm. This is really about promoting something good for our students. And this is where we have to balance the risk and the cost. And so beneficence and non-maleficence might come in conflict with each other, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But there's also benefits at different levels. And so we want to think about the scope of it. Like what might be a benefit for an individual student might not be beneficial for the entire system or for the entire class. What might seem like a direct benefit for the student might also be contrast with an indirect benefit. And so maybe the learning goals aren't really met much better by an AI technology, but them being prepared to later use that AI technology in their careers is an indirect benefit, right? So direct benefit being how much it's helping them in their current academic goal of like whatever pedagogical goal you have in your class, and the indirect benefit being how much it's helping them with a future career because they've been acquainted with AI technology. There'll be short-term benefits and long-term benefits. And then we want to figure out how exactly we're measuring benefit. And this one, I'm going to spare this conversation, but bioethicists spent a lot of time figuring out how to measure benefit, and they came up with a quality of life as their metric, and that works well for them. We don't have an equivalent in education right now, and people have tried to say standardized testing, and I think, again, that especially at the higher ed level, but universally, it's a limited way of measuring benefit to our students. And so we don't have an equivalent with education. Some of the energy we might want to spend is figuring out what that looks like to define and measure benefit as a whole. And in the educational context, this might mean personalized learning might be a benefit because it's tailored to individual needs. We might have an enhanced accessibility. We might have better assessments with more frequent and detailed feedback because the AI system can respond much more quickly and in the moment. And it might cut down on your administrative work, and that might provide some extra time for student-educator interactions. And these mirror kind of some of the benefits we talked about earlier. But there are some challenges between what these benefits are, and some of those are the risks that they pose, right? So there'll be a trade-off between how much data we give up and how personalized the technology can be. There'll be a trade-off between how much human interaction folks get and the efficiency of some of the things that AI can do. There'll be a trade-off between self-fulfilling prophecies of the AI algorithm deciding the student is not good enough to get into this particular course, or they're going to struggle in this course, and so they have to take a different course, versus making use of when predictive analytics can actually be helpful for that kind of decision making. There'll be times where we will implement technologies to help our strongest students versus when we're using it to create more accessible learning. There'll be times where we can personalize education, but that might be the cost at some homogenization, or that might be a good thing. We might say that these AI algorithms homogenizing in some ways is good. And those are conflicts that we might want to revisit. There might be times when we think that automation is helpful because it allows our students to maybe approach the problem from a different aspect. But there might be times when that conflicts with critical thinking skills for our students. And there might be benefits that we build at institutions that might trade off with benefits for our students. And a very simple, maybe a drastic snowman argument, but nonetheless, just to help illustrate the kind of conflict is if we decide that it's better for the institution to cut down on the number of human instructors because we're getting a lot of those benefits close to the same benefits for our students using AI instructors, that might be an institutional benefit because you're able to reduce your costs, but still come at the cost of your students getting their 100% experience. So that not a nuanced example, but kind of illustrates what I mean by institutional versus student benefits. Okay, benefits, the strategies I've kind of been speaking about as I explain these. So principle 3 is the do no harm, so non-maleficence. So the simple idea being that we have an obligation to not harm our students by introducing these technologies. And so we want to figure out how we're going to balance whatever potential harms come from the technologies with those benefits. There are different types of harms that we might think about. So there's actual physical harm, there's psychological harm, there's social harm, and then there's economic harm. Some of these things might harm students from all these perspectives, while others might harm students from one. And we want to figure out how we're going to weigh that against benefits that might also traverse all these different categories. We want to be proactive about identifying what those harms might be. And so even if they don't seem obvious to us in the moment, there might maybe some further research, taking some time to think about it, taking some time to do some pilots might reveal some of those harms. We want to also mitigate unintended consequences. And so even if we figure out that their benefits are really strong, we still want to figure out how we're going to mitigate those harms if we know that they're going to be there and implement safeguards to do so. So in the educational context, these harms mirror pretty much what we talked about earlier when we talked about what the risks are, the privacy violations for our students, them being exposed to the bias. Mental health impacts is one we haven't yet talked about, but increased loneliness for our students, decreased social emotional learning, those kinds of things might be a harm that we want to think about. Skill atrophy, including critical thinking that we talked about, misinformation and manipulation. What are we exposing them to in terms of actors who are misusing this? And job preparedness. Are we hurting them by not exposing it because they're not prepared for their jobs? So strategies for this, I'll go through because I don't think we've talked about some of these. We want to make sure that we are, doing a thorough evaluation of the harms like we talked about. But there are, strategies for bias detection and mitigation. So we're starting to see that the AI companies themselves are going to come up with some sort of methods for these. And there might be more that we can do in the classroom. And so there's prompts that you can write that explicitly address the biases and fight them. And so you might say, when you ask to make a reading list, you might tell it to come up with a diverse reading list as an easy example of how you might mitigate the bias that's inherent in the algorithm. You want to make sure that a human in the loop approach is there. And so everything that is being done, at least for the next few years, hopefully there's human checks on this to make sure that the kinds of harms that AI algorithms going to uniquely cause are not being caused. We want to make sure that our cybersecurity measures, both at the institutional level and for the technology companies themselves, are robust. And we want to make sure that we're prioritizing privacy preserving technologies. And so we already saw some of that come out. Apple is like doing showing us what that looks like at the consumer level by implementing AI algorithms at the device. And so none of that information is leaving your device, but actually it lives fully on your device and it's run on your device. And we might see more of that as a way to preserve privacy and see what that looks like in terms of what it means for education and not just consumer technologies. The last principle is justice. And this one is about the fair distribution of both the benefits and the harms and make sure everybody has equitable access. And so we want to think about the difference between equality and equity here. So is it just that everybody is provided with an AI tool or an AI tool that works best for them? We want to think about the fair allocation, the distributive justice questions. And so the fair allocation of all of our resources in institution. We might not have the resources to bring every single AI tool into our institutions immediately. And so how are we deciding where are we bringing them in first to achieve what ends? Procedural justice is the asking when we make these decisions, are we doing them in a way that's ethical? Are we doing it in a way that's fair? Are we including different stakeholder voices? What are we setting up student bodies that are in charge of also helping us inform our policies, making sure that how we make these decisions themselves is also a fair process. And then restorative justice and figuring out if any of these AI technologies can help us address past inequities in our educational system, or are we going to have to later deal with some restorative justice because we caused more inequities by using AI systems. The ways that this might manifest include the achievement gap could get worse or better. And so that would be a question of justice. Figuring out if AI is used in admissions and placement, does that end up making things more equitable for students, or does that start to reinforce inherent biases? Accessibility versus just using things for students' personal academic interests. The digital divide that we talked about earlier, any sort of impact on gender and racial equity because either of the biases in the algorithm or how they make decisions about our students or what kinds of predictive analytics they give, how they grade a paper based on what it can pull apart from a student's writing style. And then also just think about these things at a global level. And so, when we think about justice across the world, when you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, that bar has now gotten much higher, even just in the last 2 years, to get some sort of educational equity across the globe because of the rapid technology, the pace of rapid technological development. Kind of talked about this as I went through. Okay, so let's do some applying. But before I do that, let's take a quick pulse check on folks. How are folks doing so far? Awesome, perfect. Okay, I also just realized we're close to the end of the hour, so I want to make sure we'll do one case study, and I'm happy to stick around and talk to folks afterwards. I'll drop my email in the chat at some point too, because this stuff is lots to talk about, and we could talk more about it. But let's get a couple of case studies in so that folks can kind of do some musing. So here's an example of a university decides to implement an AI system to predict dropout risks amongst its students, and so I'd love if folks took maybe like 3 minutes, just in the interest of time, to maybe just jot some thoughts down about how they might apply these principles to this particular decision. There's some questions that I've provided here to kind of help guide what that might look like if we were to approach it from each of these principles. And like I said, there's a whole set of these in here. So in terms of practice, or if you want to go back to your institutions and do these with colleagues as an exercise, I would highly recommend it. Sometimes just like having some sort of scaffolded way to think about these really reveals how we're all thinking about them, and helps us come up with some decisions. But yeah, why don't we take until the 55 minute mark, and maybe put some thoughts in the chat, and I'd love to just see how folks would approach it using these principles. Yeah, Justin, that's a great question. So I think this is a free will determinism type question. So if we tell our students that they have a 60% risk of dropping out, what does that do in terms of how they make their decisions? Does that help them? Does that hurt them? That's kind of what we want to think about in terms of the academic freedom here. Are they going to get caught up by the decision that the algorithm itself makes or predicts? And if anybody wants to also like speak, I think you can raise your hand. We could definitely unmute. I'm happy to hear voices, but chat sometimes is just easier. Yeah, there's some great points coming up in the chat. And it sounds like some folks have some experience with it, like these questions already being raised at their institutions. Yes, and so some of the types of arguments that are coming up are good because you want to think about, are there alternatives to achieving the same ends, right? So maybe not framing it as a dropout risk and framing it as like needs for success might dramatically change. It might be a different tool, but it might achieve the same ends and prevent some of the harms. There might be other alternatives that don't use AI, and so maybe our existing signals to our students and to our faculty already work in terms of helping us. We already maybe know that when a student has had 2 semesters of 2 failing courses, that's when we have to start intervening. And AI is not really going to give us much more information than we already have from data like that. Then maybe we don't want to risk some of the questions of privacy issues in particular that were raised, or is there going to have biases that are more are deeper than just being able to look at some student transcripts. Yeah, awesome. So these are all good preliminary thoughts on this. But the idea is to kind of like go through for any particular decision that we're facing about AI in education, and use each of these principles to kind of think about how might I think about this particular question from this angle, and think about it from all four, and then kind of come up with your final determination as to whether or not the decision is worth making, or is going to harm your students more. There's some questions here. There's one about automated test, essay scoring that I think is worth checking out for folks as well. But in the interest of, like I said, these will all be shared. I'm dropping my email in the chat, but I want to make sure that I point you all to this particular reading. The first reading I don't recommend for most folks. This is the actual textbook on biomedical ethics. I don't think you need that in order to kind of make sense of this. But I do highly recommend the second article, which is arguing for why we need a field of educational ethics. So it's more general. It's not specific to AI in education. It's more about why across educational institutions we need to start embracing like thinking about this in a more rigorous and systematic way. And so that I recommend for everybody who's working in education to kind of think about, how do we integrate ethics within our practice? We have very few minutes, but I'm happy to stick around and take questions. And let me drop my email in the chat for folks as well. And I'm happy to talk more, Zoom call or email. These conversations are really important, and the more we have them, the more we'll be able to kind of navigate the next few, years of challenges.
Well, Crichton Shaw, this was very, very insightful and practical implications concerning principlism and how it can be a guiding framework in AI integration. So I want to thank you very, very much for your thoughtful presentation today. And I'm sure many people are going to be reaching out to you. Unfortunately, we can't keep the chat open because we need to shut this down in just a couple of minutes, but you do have all of our appreciation for your presentation. It was very well done. I liked the graphics and the content was superb. Good use of the case studies to get that participation. So again, that was a very, very well done job, and we do appreciate your work today. Do you have any last words for us?
I just hope folks take some time to reflect. That's the goal here, is that we all need to spend some time thinking about these things and then talking about them later. But hopefully you all get a chance today at some point before you go to bed to just like think about how you might, a question that's been bothering you and how this might help you answer it or get closer to an answer.
Well, definitely a lot of food for thought there. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and thank you for contributing to this conference. Do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.
Thank you.